Welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches for part 2 of my Ask Anything I'll Probably Answer session. This one is more fleeting in a sense. The first one was about me and my collecting journey. That one's probably pretty permanent and won't change. This second part's all the other questions you guys asked me about kind of the watches and the watch industry, and it's a bit more temporal. It's a bit more about now. So I'm making a separate video and putting that out, well, tonight. Someone asked me a very specific question. What did I think of the Seiko SBDC 055 and Seiko Prospex watches in general? Well, let me start with the back end of that. Prospex watches in general. Well, that starts at like a $300, say Samurai, and goes through to like a $6,000. These new LX ones. So that's a fair old range of watches. In general, I like them. I collect Seiko divers. I like the Prospex. I probably haven't reached into I absolutely haven't reached into the upper levels of that range. Probably not going to, or at least not for a long time. But I do like the range. I am something of a Seiko fan, and I think the Prospex line is where I live. The SBDC range is where I think the Seiko starts to sort of set itself apart and becomes where you want to buy. I've got a Monster, I've got a Samurai, I've got an SKX, and I've got a Turtle, and I'm not in love with any of those watches. They're good watches, but they're not great watches, and really the only way I justified them to myself was about getting into watches and collecting and Seiko divers, etc, etc. I have the SBDC 063, and that's the first Seiko diver that I love. I really enjoy that watch, and my general opinion is, if you're going to get into Seiko divers, it's so tempting to pull the trigger on those cheaper ones, but I would strongly suggest you hold on for, if it takes you 3 months to save up to $300 to get a Samurai, I would so strongly suggest it's worth waiting another 2 months. Keep saving, spend the $650 and get something in the SBDC range. Now, I personally prefer like the 60 series, which has kind of got the rounder indices over the 55 series, which are the more blocky square ones. But either one, great watches, and I recommend them. I like them. Staying with Seiko, or the Grand Seiko thing, someone asked me where I thought Grand Seiko would be in 10 years. I think Grand Seiko will continue to move away from Seiko. I think that within 10 years you will see Grand Seiko not being sold at Seiko boutiques, but instead through completely different stores, completely different web channels. I think you'll continue to see that drift away. I think you will see prices for Grand Seiko continue to rise, as Grand Seiko won't be seen as a value proposition anymore, but will simply sell itself on straight out quality. I think it will probably stay kind of related to Rolex, and that as Rolex goes up, so will Grand Seiko. That said, and I'll link what I think about what is going to happen with Grand Seiko and Prospex, I think we will see Prospex also move away from the remainder of the Seiko line. I think it's a 50-50 bet that within the next 10 years there will be watches that are branded solely as Prospex and have no Seiko branding on them at all, and that the core of the Prospex brand will compete, or sort of go head to head with something like the Omega Seamaster and Railmaster in terms of quality and price point. Getting away from the Seiko stuff, people ask me what I thought about digital watches. I don't really have a strong opinion on one way or the other. I don't hate them. It's not like if you're wearing a digital watch you've done something wrong, but they're not for me. They don't really appeal to me. I have got, I think, the obligatory FW whatever it is, FW 90 or 50 or something, Casio. I picked it up because I felt like I should have it. I think I've worn it once and it's living in a box somewhere, and given that they're worth like literally maybe $15, I think it would cost me more to post it to someone were I to sell it. So it's probably going to keep bouncing around the bottom of a watch box everywhere. But nah, not really for me. An AniDigi thing, I could possibly one day do that. I think something like a Breitling Emergency or maybe the Seiko Ani. I don't know. Again, I'm not philosophically opposed to them. It's just not my thing at the moment. But, our things come and go. A really common question was, what were my favourite YouTube channels? And I very much put this in the ephemeral side, which is why I'm covering it today, not on the previous one, because the nature of YouTube channels is that they come and go. Now, as part of what I do, I track maybe 50 or 60 different channels, the vast bulk of which I watch, some of them aren't. And so if you ask me for my favorites, that's tricky because I tend to jump in and out depending on the content. But what I did was I sat down and thought really hard about what are the 5 channels, or what are the channels, and it turns out there's 5. What are the 5 channels I will watch pretty much start to finish regardless of what they're covering. It's just because I enjoy the content. And so here they are. First off is Bark and Jack. I've referred to Adrian and Bark and Jack a lot. I really like that channel, probably because of Adrian's just so kind of earnest and so keen, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like he talks a lot about like being on his watch journey, and I feel like I've invested in that journey and I'm along for the ride with him. So it's kind of, it's for me, it's more like watching something unfold than necessarily watch him talking about a watch. So maybe that's odd. The next channel is one that actually one of my viewers put me onto. So thanks very much, founder. The ID Guy. Now the ID Guy ID stands for industrial design, and he's an industrial designer that looks at watches through a very design lens, really focuses on that. Look, there are some parts of what he does that I'm not a fan of, so he'll go into a review of a watch, like a review of the watch based on how it looks from a design point of view. And I think he trips up there sometimes. I think also he'll say that, that there'll be a watch which he does not like, or there'll be parts of a watch design that he does not like. Recognize that the design doesn't have to be for everyone, but that he'll label those things that he doesn't like necessarily as flaws, as opposed to just choices that someone made because they weren't necessarily chasing the biggest market they could possibly get. So, maybe I'm just throwing a rock at him because he's got his own opinions and he's strong about them, and sometimes he's not particularly careful about how he expresses it. But even when I disagree with him, and the other thing is, for a little while when he started, he had this weird thing with Parnas, which is, continues to strike me as really weird, given that he's this industrial design guy and spending quite a lot of time looking at a knockoff merchant. That I found that weird, but he seems to have moved past that phase, so maybe that was just a sort of a pipe cleaner for figuring out what was going on. But anyway, even when I disagree with him, even when he's not doing a watch I particularly like, even when he's talking about something like a knockoff Parnas, I still kind of want to watch it, because just watching someone apply the language of design to a watch is really instructive. And I've learnt so much about, it's like someone talking about a painting you don't like very much, but the way they talk about the painting teaches you about paintings in general. That's how I find with the ID Guy. Even when he's talking about a watch I don't like, the way he talks about it gives me a new way of looking at how watches can be thought about. The next channel that for me is a much watch is Chris over at Horology House. And for one simple reason, it's just gorgeous watch porn. Yes, I will admit, there are times where I have watched that channel with the sound off and just enjoyed the images. And so I would encourage you, first off, do listen to him. He knows his stuff and he's quite good talking about watches, but the imagery is amazing. The only thing I don't like about it is he makes me look at my photos and just want to die a little bit. But yeah, go watch it. It's fantastic. So number 4 would be the Watchfinder site. There are two big sites, two big dealer sites that do a lot of coverage, Watchfinder and Watchbox. Watchbox is meh. I mean, Tim knows his stuff, but to be honest, a lot of the Watchbox studio stuff is pretty average. But put that to one side. We're not talking about Watchbox. I'm not a massive fan of that. But Watchfinder is great, informative, really well shot. They don't seem to. I mean, clearly they're a dealer site, so clearly they're going to be focusing on watches they're trying to sell. But they're not particularly heavy-handed. There's no go over and check our watch in the shop type stuff. It's really good quality, and it's getting really funny. I'm going to talk about this in another one, but obviously if you don't know, if you've been living under a rock, Watchbox is owned by Richemont. At the same time, Watchbox is a dealer site, so they sell a lot of Rolex. And I'm absolutely convinced that there's a little bit of Rolex trolling going on in some of the more recent videos, and I'm finding it hilarious. So yeah, Watchfinder, really good, recommend them. And the last YouTube channel I'd recommend is that I watch all the time, is kind of personal to me, and that sounds really intense, and I don't mean to be. It's Clockbait. Now, they started at a very similar time. I think they might have been a month or two after me, and we sort of, I won't say we found each other, we exchanged the odd message, but we kind of know each other, and we see each other on Facebook, and we kind of both have this loose connection through the Scottish Watchers podcast, where we occasionally comment and have got cross referrals. So they're just a pair of guys I've kind of watched, and we ran this little sort of faux competition, which they kicked my ass in, by the way, to be the first to get to 1,000 subs. So I've sort of had a relationship, if that sounds right, with those guys. But more than that, they're just funny. When so many of the rest of us are a little bit po-faced about watches and a little bit kind of, we take ourselves just a tad too seriously, there's an element of kind of the Top Gear, take the piss out of themselves, don't take watches too seriously in what they do. And so I think I enjoy what they do. I think they bring something a little bit different, kind of like Gunzap. They bring things a little bit different to the watch community, and they're one of my faves. Okay, getting back to the watch community, getting back to the watch industry type stuff. A lot of you asked what my opinion was on the outlook for the watch industry over the next 10 years or so. Really tricky. In some ways, I see it staying largely as it is. I think the next 10 years will be a bit like now, but just a little bit different, 5 to 10% different across the entire industry. So I'm not seeing wholesale collapses anywhere. I'm not seeing massive surges of growth anywhere. I think you're just going to see incremental changes, except in some parts. And I think the one thing I would say is I reckon that I'll call it the top end of the bottom of the market. So everything in that like $500 to $1,500 range, I think that's going to get tighter and tighter over the next 10 years. Now, all the budget numbers and all the things coming out of Switzerland are saying, look, there's some ups and downs across the market, but it's the budget Swiss end that seems to be really taking the hit to the head at the moment. And those numbers are really bad. And I don't think they're going to get much better. I think that's going to continue to struggle. And I think we're going to see a couple of things fall out of that. I believe we will see some watch brands go to the wall. Yeah, so if you look at that end of the market and look at something like Swatch, they've got maybe, off the top of my head, I can think of, they've got Mido, Tissot, Hamilton, Satina. I can't think of any others, but I think there's one or two more brands just within the Swatch group in that exact area, which is shrinking. Now, it could be that the economies of scale mean that it really makes not much difference to Swatch, and the benefit of having kind of maybe market-specific brands for things like Satina, which seem to be big in some places but not in others, maybe that works for them. But I have a suspicion it doesn't, and I would not be surprised to see, certainly within the big groups where you have brands at the low end that are overlapping, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of them go by the wayside. We've already seen Fortis really struggle. They're kind of in that area. They got a bailout at the last minute, but you wonder whether they'll survive. Jean Ricard got closed down by the Kering Group. Eterna seems to have been, if not closed, then put on the back burner. So as I said, I think we'll see some brands kind of struggle in that space. I think you're also going to see another interesting response, which is brands that were in that space muscling up, trying to get themselves out of that area and getting into the $2,500–3,500 US area where they feel a little bit safer. A little comment here, why do I think that is? That $1,500 market seems to be where the dividing line is. I kind of blame mobile phones. My gut feel, this isn't based on any great research or anything, but it's kind of like just me looking at what's happening. My feeling is that we, the affluent watch buyer who can afford to buy things like this as a hobby, have got to the point now where we've got used to buying a new phone every 3 or 4 years. Think about what that means. Our EDC, our everyday carry, so our phones and our wallets and our watches and the things that we turn over they are things we expect to turn over. They are things we expect to have a lifespan, and we've got comfortable with the idea that we'll spend somewhere between $700 and $1,500 every couple of years churning that stuff over. We've had several generations of mobile phone go through that, and we've got used to it. We're now acclimatized to it. And once you get used to that, then the unique selling point of the mechanical watch, that you don't have to turn it over, is no longer that compelling. I think that compelling feature of the low-end Swiss watch is no longer selling watches. People are happy. So if you'd have said to someone, if you could have gone back in time 15 years and said, buy something like an Apple Watch, it'll be great, but oh, by the way, in 5 years' time, it'll be a brick and you'll have to replace it. People would look at you as though you'd grown a second head and said, why on earth would I do that? Say that same thing now in 2019, and most people would go, yeah, sounds okay. But yeah, well, I'll buy the Apple Watch 4, and I know that by the time the Apple Watch 7 comes out, it'll be a brick, but that's okay. I'll buy the Apple Watch 7. So I think that's what's affecting that end of the market. I don't think it's going to change, and I think it's going to get pretty tight at, like that, as I said, that very low-end Swiss. Everything else I think will be okay, plus or minus 5%. We'll see some winners, some losers, but across the market, I don't think much change. Another question that I got asked was around about what my thoughts were about the glut of watches, the rise of the grey market, or the existence of the grey market, and how the industry might respond if there was an economic downturn, like across the industry. I suppose I'll answer that in a couple of ways. The first one is, if you look at the annual reports of pretty much every one of the big groups, like LVMH or Richemont or Swatch, who definitely address this issue, they're all talking about reining back on overproduction. They're all talking about, and Swatch had in their last annual report, they had a very specific line about trying to reduce the impact of the grey market. And there's a couple of things I'd take out of that. One, if you do look at their annual reports, you do see falling sales numbers, but the watches, the income and profits have taken something of a hit, but not one that commensurate with the drop in sales. And I think what you're seeing there is a little bit of people moving up market, but mostly I suspect it's just there's cuts in production. They're not overproducing anymore. Or if they are overproducing, they're not overproducing to the same extent. What you're also seeing is that the grey market is continuing to exist, and continues actually to be quite strong, in that there are some instances where I've seen watches that were released in Baselworld 2019. So this year's Baselworld watches are turning up at grey market sellers like Joe Michelp or Chronext now, already 6 months in. My theory on this is that is not the result of overproduction. That is, in fact, what's happening is the big players, the big watch manufacturers, are now building the grey market into their distribution channels. In a sense, they're sort of whitening up the grey market. They're anticipating that they will pump some watches, they will have some, not an uncontrolled excess, but a deliberate controlled slight overproduction that they will immediately channel into a thin run into the grey market to give them a kind of contingency. It means that in the event of a downturn, what they can do is just throttle back on what they're giving into the greyish market, but continue to support their ADs. And so my gut feel is that what we're seeing is, again, not a wholesale change, but just increased discipline from the big manufacturers. No longer uncontrolled, unforecast excess, but rather some quite controlled and carefully managed contingency, which is being fed into the grey market. So the grey market continues to exist, but it's not, as I said, it's not this uncontrolled dumping. And I think if there is a downturn, all you'll see is some taps being turned, and then the grey market will lose their access. Okay, so the last question I got, I'm not sure if it was the last question I got asked, but certainly the last question I'm going to answer is, do I think that collectors affect the watch market? And my answer to that is an emphatic no and an emphatic yes. And what I mean by that is it depends on what you mean by the market. And in particular, I think there's a macro watch market, and then there's micro markets that are created solely by collectors. So if we talk about, do collectors affect the watch market, and we'll define the market as steel dive watches between $1,500 and $5,000. No, I don't think watch collectors affect that much at all. I think the prices there fall pretty much where they would fall, and they're driven largely by plain old everyday normal collectors. Normal watch buyers. What I would say is that collectors, and particularly in a post-Instagram, post-YouTube environment, have within the macro market created micro markets. They've created a micro market of steel Rolex sports models. And then, since you've, instead of having all the collectors spread across the macro market, what they're doing is herding into these micro markets and drinking those wells dry, while all the others around them are, rich and plentiful and have got plenty for everyone. And then looking up and complaining about the fact that their well is dry now. I don't love the way, I've spoken before about this, I don't love the way that Rolex is treating its customers. I think it's a little bit dismissive. I won't say they enjoy the problem that is now happening in that Rolex market, but I don't think they're entirely unhappy about it. I think it does help them achieve some of the things that I think Rolex is trying to achieve, of move itself up market. So it's kind of, they don't necessarily, Rolex isn't unhappy with the position that they're in. But at the same time, no one's holding a gun to your head and making you buy a Rolex. At any time, the only person who has decided that they absolutely positively must have that Rolex is you, is the collector. If you don't like that micro market, there are plenty of other wells for you to drink from. So, like I said, do watch collectors affect the macro market? No. Watch collectors have, through their own choices, created micro markets, which they have now drunk dry. Yeah, maybe the watch companies could do, the small number of watch companies that are in that position. They could probably do some more to help out. And I don't love the way they're responding to it, but it's not terrible. If you really the watch collectors are doing this to themselves. There are plenty of other watch companies that make really good watches. And if you've decided that you absolutely have to have a Rolex Submariner, then that's on you. That's not on Rolex. So that's kind of my take. Anyway, so that's all the questions people asked me about watches and the watch industry and a little bit of the watch media. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Oh, one last thing. Tennessee Mike asked me if I've cleaned up how long it took me to clean up my workstation. I'll put a picture up now. What you'll see is I haven't cleaned up my workstation at all. You just get really good at moving stuff out of camera view. So, yeah, that's the other thing. Okay, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Thanks very much for watching. Wait a little while. A card's going to come up. It's got my Instagram and email address. Please follow me, and you can contact me through those. Yeah, thanks very much. Bye.